He stole one yam from a sacred grove, and before sunrise, the ground started eating him alive. On today's episode of The Wander's Tales, we dive where quiet courage prevails. Hidden truths and hearts so bold, stories of fear left untold. If this calls to you, don't delay, subscribe, tap the bell and stay with us, thank you. The humidity in Kumasi did not just sit on the skin. It colonized the lungs, thick with the scent of roasted plantains, diesel exhaust, and the metallic tang of an approaching storm that never quite arrived. Kofi sat on the plastic chair of the Komfo Anakai Teaching Hospital, the fluorescent lights overhead flickering with a rhythmic, buzzing malice that felt like a migraine taking root in his temples. In his hand, the crumpled hospital invoice felt heavier than a lead ingot, the numbers printed in a sterile, uncompromising font that mocked his empty bank account. He watched the nurses move with a practiced, weary efficiency, their footsteps echoing against the linoleum like the ticking of a clock he couldn't afford to wind. Every breath his mother took in the ward behind the double doors was a breath he was currently stealing from a future he hadn't yet earned. The modern world was a predator of paper and coin, and as he looked at his calloused hands that had spent the last 3 years hauling cement bags for a contractor who disappeared every payday, he realized that the city had no mercy for those who traded in sweat instead of digital transfers. The air in the waiting room was sterile, smelling of bleach and old grief, a sharp contrast to the earthy, rich scent of the village he had left behind, a scent that now seemed to call to him from the dark corners of his memory, promising a different, more ancient kind of debt. He stepped out of the hospital into the chaotic embrace of the Kumasi night, the streets a neon-veined labyrinth of tro-tro horns and the rhythmic shouting of street preachers. The preachers spoke of miracles and blood, of tithing for salvation, but Kofi's mind was elsewhere, drifting toward the silent, dark heart of the Ashanti forest that bordered his family's ancestral lands. He thought of his mother, Amma, whose skin had turned the color of dry ash, and whose laughter had been replaced by a wet, rattling sound that seemed to pull the very life from her chest. The doctors spoke of pulmonary complications and specialized canisters, but to Kofi, it felt as though the earth itself was reclaiming her, drawing her back into the soil before her time. He felt a sudden, sharp spike of resentment toward the towering glass buildings and the luxury SUVs that splashed through the muddy potholes. They lived in a world of insurance and safety nets, while he stood on the precipice of a void. His father had died in the Great Famine, leaving behind nothing but a reputation for stoicism and a small plot of land that bordered the sacred grove, a place where the ancestors were said to walk, and where the trees were older than the concept of Ghana itself. As he walked toward the taxi park, the decision didn't come as a sudden bolt of lightning, but as a slow, inevitable coldness that settled in his marrow. He would return to the village, not to pray, but to take what the earth had been hoarding while his family starved. The village of his birth was a ghost of its former self, a cluster of mud brick and corrugated iron huddling under the watchful, oppressive gaze of the sacred grove. As Kofi walked the narrow path toward his mother's hut, the moonlight filtered through the canopy of the forest, casting long, skeletal shadows that seemed to reach out and pull at his clothes. He could hear the low, rhythmic chanting of the insects, a sound that felt less like nature and more like a warning, a collective heartbeat of 1,000 unseen eyes. His sister, Akasua, was sitting by a small cooking fire, her face etched with a fatigue that made her look decades older than her 20 years. They didn't speak of the money or the medicine. The silence between them was a thick, suffocating blanket woven from years of shared poverty, and the mutual understanding that they were reaching the end of their options. The grove loomed behind their house, a wall of impenetrable green that even the boldest hunters avoided after dusk, a place where the laws of the Republic of Ghana ceased to exist and were replaced by the older, harsher laws of the Ashanti spirits. To the modern Ghanaian, the grove was a relic of superstition, a biodiversity hotspot to be protected by environmental agencies, but to those who lived in its shadow, It was a living, breathing entity with a long memory and an even longer reach. Kofi watched the way the shadows of the trees danced on the walls of the hut, feeling the weight of the machete tucked into his belt like a shameful secret. He remembered the stories his grandfather used to tell, of men who entered the grove with greed in their hearts and never returned, their bones becoming the roots of the silk cotton trees. But those were stories for children, he told himself, a psychological fence built by the elders to keep the community's resources from being depleted. He looked at Akasua, whose eyes were fixed on the flickering embers, and he saw the reflection of a life spent in perpetual hunger, a life that the grove, with its lush, untouched abundance, could easily sustain if only the taboos were ignored. The yam he sought was not just food. It was a symbol of the grove's untapped power, a tuber that grew in the hallowed soil where the ancestors' spirits were said to rest. He waited until Akasua's breathing became deep and rhythmic, until the village fires had died down to glowing eyes in the dark, and then he stood up, his movements fluid and silent as a predator. The air grew colder as he approached the boundary of the grove, the temperature dropping with every step as if he were walking into a refrigerated vault. The boundary was marked by nothing more than a row of weathered stones, but as Kofi crossed it, he felt a distinct, physical resistance, a momentary thickening of the air that made his skin crawl with 1,000 invisible needles. Inside the grove, the darkness was not an absence of light, but a physical weight that pressed against Kofi's chest, making every breath a conscious effort. The canopy was so dense that not even the African moon could penetrate it, leaving him to navigate by the memory of the land and the strange, bioluminescent fungi that pulsed with a faint, sickly green light on the rotting logs. He moved toward the center, toward the place where the soil was said to be the richest, where the yams grew to the size of a man's torso, their skins dark and rough like the bark of the trees. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird, each thud sounding like a drum in the absolute silence of the forest. There were no crickets here, no night birds, only the sound of his own pulse and the occasional, inexplicable snap of a twig in the distance. He found the mound he was looking for, a raised portion of earth near the base of a massive, ancient tree whose roots looked like the gnarled limbs of giants. The soil here was different. It felt warm to the touch, vibrating with a low-frequency hum that he felt in his teeth rather than his ears. As he plunged his machete into the earth, the ground didn't resist. It seemed to part for him, the soil yielding with a wet, sighing sound that sent a jolt of pure electricity up his spine. He dug with a frantic, feverish energy, his fingers clawing at the dirt, unearthing the yam that lay buried like a buried secret. It was magnificent, a heavy, obsidian-dark tuber that felt strangely warm, almost like living flesh in his hands. As he pulled it from the earth, a sudden, violent gust of wind tore through the canopy, though the air at ground level remained deathly still. The trees groaned, a deep wooden sound of agony that echoed through the grove, and for a moment Kofi thought he heard a voice, a low, distorted whisper that called out a name he didn't recognize. He didn't linger. He shoved the yam into his burlap sack and turned to run, his feet heavy as if the ground were suddenly made of molasses. He burst through the boundary of the grove, his lungs burning, and didn't stop until he reached the safety of his courtyard, the stolen prize clutched to his chest. He hid the sack under a pile of dry corn husks, his hands shaking so violently he could barely stand. He told himself he had won, that the spirits were myths and the forest was just wood and dirt. He lay down on his mat, the adrenaline slowly receding to leave a hollow, aching exhaustion. But as he closed his eyes, he felt a strange sensation in his feet, a tingling, cold numbness that felt like water seeping into his skin, a sensation that began at his toes and slowly, methodically, began to wrap itself around his ankles. The transition from sleep to wakefulness was not a gradual climb, but a sudden, terrifying plunge into a reality that defied the logic of the waking world. Kofi tried to sit up, to shake off the lingering remnants of a dream involving his father's funeral, but his legs refused to obey. He looked down in the dim, pre-dawn light and felt his breath hitch in his throat. His feet were gone. Not severed, not hidden by a blanket, but submerged directly into the hard-packed dirt of the courtyard floor as if the earth had turned to liquid and then solidified around him. He tugged, his muscles straining until they screamed, but there was no give, no wiggle of a toe, no shifting of the dirt. It was as if he had been cast in concrete, but the concrete was the very ground he had walked on his entire life. The sensation was not one of pain, but of an overwhelming, claustrophobic pressure, a heavy, cold embrace that felt like the weight of the entire African continent pressing down on his bones. He looked toward the pile of corn husks where the stolen yam was hidden, and he could swear he saw the sack pulsing, a slow, rhythmic expansion and contraction that matched the beating of his own frantic heart. The first rays of the sun began to bleed across the horizon, painting the sky in bruises of purple and gold, but the light brought no comfort. With every inch the sun climbed, Kofi felt the ground respond, a subtle but undeniable upward movement of the soil. It was as if the earth were rising to meet him, or he was being pulled down into a lightless abyss. He tried to cry out for Akasua, but his throat felt as though it were filled with dry sand, his voice coming out as a raspy, pathetic whimper. He looked at his ankles, and the soil was already beginning to creep toward his calves, the dirt textured and dark, looking almost like the skin of the yam he had stolen. He realized then that the grove had not followed him. It had simply extended its reach, the courtyard no longer a place of domestic safety, but an outpost of the sacred, vengeful forest. The silence of the village was broken only by the distant crowing of a rooster, a mundane sound that felt absurdly out of place in the face of this supernatural judgment. He began to scratch at the ground with his fingernails, desperate to claw himself free, but the soil was impenetrable, harder than granite, yet it continued to flow upward around his limbs with the relentless persistence of a rising tide. He was a man rooted, a human planting in a garden of sins, and as the full realization of his predicament settled over him, he felt the first true wave of terror, not the sharp terror of a predator's attack, but the deep, existential horror of being erased by the very world he inhabited. The sun did not rise over the village of Asantamanso. It merely peeled back the skin of the night to reveal a nightmare that the darkness had been unsuccessfully trying to hide. As the first golden threads of light snagged on the jagged leaves of the sacred grove, Kofi remained standing in the center of his family's compound, a living statue of flesh and mounting terror. The earth had claimed him up to his shins, the red Ghanaian clay having transitioned from a liquid-like embrace into a solid, unyielding grip that felt more like the jaws of a predator than the floor of a home. He could see the individual grains of sand, and the tiny, frantic movements of ants scurrying across the surface of the ground that was slowly erasing his existence. The air was beginning to hum with the waking sounds of the village, the rhythmic thud of pestles hitting mortars, the distant, tinny sound of a radio playing high-life music, and the smell of wood smoke. But to Kofi, these familiar comforts felt like echoes from a world he no longer inhabited. His legs felt cold, a deep, structural chill that seemed to be turning his marrow into silt, and he realized with a jolt of pure, existential dread that he could no longer feel his toes. He was becoming a part of the landscape, a human fence post intended to mark the boundary between the world of the living and the domain of the ancestors. The modern world, with its pharmacies and its currency and its sterile hospital rooms, felt like a thin, pathetic veil that had been torn away to reveal the ancient, pulsing machinery of a justice system that didn't care about his reasons, only his actions. The stillness of his body was a forced meditation, a paralysis that allowed his mind to spiral into the darkest corridors of his memory. He thought about the yam hidden under the corn husks, just 10 feet away, yet it might as well have been on the other side of the Atlantic. It was a tuber of immense weight, its skin dark and textured like the very soil that was currently consuming him, and he could feel its presence like a hot coal in his mind. He had thought he could sneak into the grove, take a small fragment of the earth's abundance, and trade it for the breath of his mother, but he had failed to understand that the grove didn't operate on the logic of trade. It operated on the logic of balance. Every inch of soil that rose up his legs was a measurement of the spiritual debt he had incurred, a physical manifestation of the taboo he had shattered with his machete. He looked at the horizon, watching the sun climb with an agonizing slowness, and he knew that by the time it reached its zenith, his situation would be far worse. The village was starting to stir, and soon the first person would walk past his gate, perhaps his sister Akasua, perhaps a neighbor heading to the market, and the secret he had buried in the dark would be illuminated by the uncompromising glare of the morning. He tried to move his fingers, to reach for the machete he had dropped during his first panic, but his arms felt heavy, as if the gravity in this specific patch of dirt had been tripled. He was a prisoner of the planet, a man being reclaimed by the source of all life because he had dared to treat the sacred as a supermarket. The scream that finally shattered the morning came from Akasua, and it was a sound that didn't belong in the throat of a 20-year-old girl. It was an ancient, jagged noise that seemed to vibrate through the very foundations of the hut. She had stepped out with a basin of water to begin the morning wash, only to find her brother standing in the center of the courtyard, his legs disappearing into the hard-packed earth as if he were sinking into a swamp of stone. The basin hit the ground, shattering into plastic shards, and within minutes, the quiet of the morning was replaced by a chaotic swarm of voices. Neighbors drifted in from the narrow paths, their faces a mixture of morbid curiosity and the kind of deep, ancestral fear that survives even in the age of smartphones and satellite TV. They kept a respectful, terrified distance, forming a wide circle around Kofi, who stood shivering despite the growing heat of the day. They saw the way the soil around his calves seemed to be vibrating, a subtle rhythmic pulsing that suggested the earth was not just holding him, but actively pulling him downward. The whispers began, bitter, fearful things, about the grove, about the sudden sickness of Amma, and about the look of guilt that was etched into Kofi's face like a scar. They didn't see a neighbor in trouble. They saw a lightning rod for divine wrath, and the air in the courtyard grew thick with the scent of a communal judgment that was already being passed before a single word of explanation was offered. The arrival of Nana Osai, the eldest of the village council, brought a sudden, heavy silence to the gathering. He moved with a slow, deliberate dignity, his kente cloth draped over one shoulder, his staff clicking against the dry ground with a sound like a gavel. He did not ask Kofi what had happened. He simply looked at the way the earth had climbed to the midcalf, the soil looking richer and darker than any dirt found in a domestic courtyard. Nana Osai's eyes were not filled with pity, but with a weary, clinical detachment, the look of a man who had seen the old ways manifest in the modern world before and knew that there was no easy cure for a spiritual infection. He signaled for the people to move back, creating a taboo zone around Kofi, as if the earth's hunger might be contagious. The crowd obeyed instantly, the modern veneer of the village, the school uniforms, the cellular phones, the plastic chairs, falling away to reveal the skeletal structure of a society that still remembered the names of the forest gods. Kofi looked at Nana Osai, his eyes pleading for a mercy that the elder didn't have the authority to give. The elder looked toward the sacred grove, which loomed on the horizon like a dark, silent judge, its canopy unmoving even as a light breeze began to stir the dust in the street. "The earth has a long memory, Kofi," the old man finally said. His voice a low rasp that seemed to come from the ground itself, and it does not like to be robbed of its sleep. By noon, the tropical sun was a white-hot hammer, beating down on the village and turning the courtyard into a kiln, but the heat of the sun was nothing compared to the rising temperature of the soil around Kofi's legs. The earth had now reached his knees, the dark, rich dirt of the grove having traveled through the subterranean layers to find him, swallowing the joints of his legs in a grip that felt like molten lead. There was a sickening, grinding sensation deep within the soil, the sound of ancient roots and stones shifting and settling as they adjusted to the new weight of their prisoner. Kofi's physical agony had moved beyond the sharp sting of a cramp into a dull, rhythmic throbbing that synchronized with his heartbeat, making him feel as though his entire lower body were being slowly ground into a pulp. He could feel the moisture being sucked out of his skin, the earth acting like a giant, thirsty sponge that was draining the very life fluid from his veins. The villagers had brought umbrellas to shield themselves from the sun as they watched the spectacle, but no one offered one to Kofi. To interfere with a judgment of the grove was to invite the same fate, and the collective survival instinct of the village was far stronger than any individual bond of friendship. Even the local priest, who had arrived with a Bible and a bottle of holy water, stood at the edge of the circle, his prayers sounding hollow and thin against the oppressive, silent power that was radiating from the ground. The transition of the soil from the calves to the knees marked a psychological threshold for both Kofi and the witnesses. At the ankles, it was a freak occurrence, a strange medical anomaly or a localized sinkhole. At the knees, it was an undeniable act of the supernatural. The way the dirt didn't just pile up, but seemed to be part of an upward-moving column of earth that originated from deep within the mantle, defied every law of physics the younger villagers had learned in school. Kofi's breathing was becoming shallow, the pressure of the earth beginning to restrict the blood flow to his upper body, causing his head to light up with dizzying flashes of white light. He looked at his knees, now vanishing beneath a layer of soil that was speckled with tiny, translucent worms, creatures that didn't belong in the dry, sun-baked dirt of a courtyard. These were the inhabitants of the deep forest, brought to the surface by the grove's intent. He realized that the earth wasn't just burying him, it was digesting him, breaking down the barrier between the human and the botanical. He felt a strange, terrifying urge to laugh, a hysterical bubble of sound that died in his throat when he realized that the pain in his knees had shifted. It was no longer the pain of pressure. It was the pain of integration, as if the nerves in his legs were being grafted onto the roots of the world. He was no longer just standing on the earth. He was becoming the earth's newest extension, a fleshy limb for a terrestrial god. As the sun began its slow, grueling descent toward the afternoon, the psychological pressure finally snapped the last of Kofi's stoicism. He didn't scream for help, and he didn't scream in pain. Instead, a name erupted from his lungs, a high, piercing cry that echoed off the mud walls of the surrounding houses. Panian, Panian, Panian. The crowd recoiled as if he had thrown a physical weight at them, the name hanging in the air like a forbidden spell. It was a name that most of the younger generation didn't recognize, but the elders froze, their faces turning the color of ash. Panian was the secret childhood name of his mother, Amma, a name that had been tucked away decades ago, a name that carried the weight of her identity before she had become a wife, a mother, and a widow. In Ashanti culture, to call out someone's secret soul name was an act of profound spiritual intimacy or desperate invocation, and by screaming it, Kofi was stripping away the layers of the present to reach back into a past that the village had tried to bury. He wasn't calling for his mother as the woman in the hospital. He was calling for the essence of the woman who had first taught him the stories of the forest, the woman whose life was now the primary currency in the terrible transaction he had initiated. The sound of the name seemed to act as a catalyst for the ground beneath him. The soil, which had been rising with a steady, mechanical persistence, suddenly surged, trembling with a localized tremor that knocked several of the onlookers off their feet. It was as if the earth itself were reacting to the name, the roots beneath the surface arguing over the vibration of the word. From the doorway of the small hut, Amma appeared, supported by Akasua and another woman, her face gaunt and her eyes glazed with the fever of her illness. When she heard her childhood name, she stopped, her body racking with a cough that seemed to pull her very soul into her throat. She looked at her son, seeing him half buried in the soil of their own home, and a look of profound, devastating recognition crossed her features. She didn't cry out in horror. She simply slumped into a chair, her gaze fixed on the spot where the earth met his knees. The elders began to whisper more frantically now, realizing that the theft of the yam was intertwined with a deeper family history than they had initially suspected. Kofi's voice continued to rasp the name, his consciousness fatting into a delirium where he was no longer a man, but a voice, a vibration trying to reach through the layers of time and soil to find the woman who had given him life, only to find that the earth was a more attentive listener than the mother he was trying to save. Akasua could no longer stand the role of the passive witness, the weight of her brother's suffering finally overbalancing the traditional fear that held the rest of the village in place. With a cry of defiance that silenced the murmuring crowd, she broke the circle, her feet kicking up dust as she ran toward the storage shed. She emerged seconds later with a heavy, rusted spade, her knuckles white as she gripped the handle with a desperation that bordered on madness. The elders shouted warnings, their voices thick with the prophecy of doom, telling her that to touch the judgment soil was to court a secondary curse, but she ignored them. She was a child of the modern age, a girl who dreamed of nursing school and city lights, and she refused to believe that the ground could be more powerful than her love for her brother. She reached Kofi and plunged the spade into the dirt at his side, intending to carve him out of the earth's grip like a fossil being extracted from stone. The moment the metal struck the soil, a sound rang out that wasn't the sound of metal on dirt. It was the sound of a bell, a deep, resonant chime that seemed to originate from the center of the earth and vibrate upward through the spade and into her arms. The resistance she met was unlike anything she had ever experienced. The soil was not packed tight. It was alive, moving with a fluid, muscular strength that pushed back against the blade of the spade. Every time she managed to lift a clod of dirt, the hole filled itself instantly, the earth flowing upward with a gravitational defiance that made her efforts look like those of a child trying to empty the ocean with a cup. She grunted with the effort, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her sweat dripping onto the very ground she was fighting. The villagers watched in a horrified trance, some crossing themselves, others clutching traditional amulets, as the girl fought a war against the planet itself. Kofi looked down at her, his eyes clouded with a mixture of gratitude and terror, trying to tell her to stop, to save herself, but his voice was now little more than a dry hiss. He could see what the others couldn't yet. The ground wasn't just resisting her, it was preparing to retaliate. The soil around the edge of her spade began to darken, turning a bruised, obsidian purple, and the temperature in the courtyard seemed to spike, the air shimmering with a localized heat that made the surrounding atmosphere feel like a furnace. Akasua didn't stop until the spade itself began to vibrate so violently that it nearly flew out of her hands, the metal glowing with a faint, dull red light that shouldn't have been possible in the midday sun. The scream that tore from Akasua's throat was different from the one she had uttered earlier. This was the sound of physical tissue being destroyed, a raw, primal howl of agony. She dropped the spade, but it was too late. The heat from the soil had traveled through the metal and the very air, and when she tried to grab her brother's arm to pull him free, the ground beneath her feet reacted with the fury of a disturbed hornet's nest. The soil she touched felt like liquid iron, a searing, supernatural heat that didn't just burn the skin but seemed to cook the bone beneath. She recoiled, stumbling back into the arms of the crowd, her palms held out in front of her. They were no longer the soft hands of a young woman. The skin had been instantly cauterized, turned into a blackened, blistered mess that looked as though she had reached into the heart of a blacksmith's forge. The smell of scorched flesh filled the courtyard, a sickly sweet scent that made the children cry and the elders turn away in shame. The ground had set its boundary, and it had enforced it with a violence that left no room for negotiation or human sentiment. The elders surged forward now, not to help, but to drag Akasua further away from the burning zone, their faces etched with a grim, "I told you so" righteousness that was more terrifying than the heat itself. Nana Osa pointed his staff at the spade, which was now sinking into the earth on its own, the wood of the handle charring as if an invisible fire were consuming it. "The grove is awake," he declared, his voice carrying the weight of a funeral bell, and it is hungry for more than just the thief. He looked at the villagers, his eyes commanding them to witness the price of interference. Akasua lay on the ground, whimpering, her hands being wrapped in cool plantain leaves by the village women, but the damage was permanent. The earth had branded her for her loyalty, leaving her with iron palms that would forever serve as a reminder of the day her brother tried to outsmart the ancestors. Kofi watched all of this through a haze of tears and mounting paralysis, the guilt of his sister's injury weighing more heavily on him than the tons of soil that were now pressing against his thighs. He realized then that his sin was not an isolated event. It was a stone thrown into a pond, and the ripples were beginning to drown everyone he loved. The sun was now directly overhead, a merciless eye watching as the earth continued its slow, methodical ascent, the soil now beginning to crest over the tops of his knees and move toward his waist. The silence that followed Akasua's injury was broken by a sound that was even more unsettling, the low, rhythmic chanting of Amma, who had managed to stand up, her body swaying as if caught in a wind that no one else could feel. She walked toward the edge of the taboo circle, her eyes fixed not on her son, but on the earth that was consuming him. Her voice was thin, but it carried an authority that made even Nana Osai step aside. She began to speak of a time 30 years ago, a time when the rains had failed for 3 consecutive seasons, and the cocoa trees had shriveled into black skeletons. It was the Great Famine, a time when the village had become a graveyard and the living had looked at the dead with envy. She spoke of Kofi's father, a man named Kwabena, who had been a guardian of the grove's secrets, and how, in his final days of starvation, he had made a desperate, forbidden pact with the spirits of the soil to ensure that his family would not be erased from the earth. The villagers leaned in, the modern world forgotten as they were pulled into the gravity of a story that had been hidden for a generation, a story of blood and survival that was now being unburied by the very soil that was burying her son. Amma's confession was a tapestry of grief and survival. She revealed that when Kwabena died, he didn't just leave behind a plot of land. He left behind a living legacy, planted in the most sacred part of the grove, a single, massive yam that had been nourished by his own blood during his final hours. It was meant to be a spiritual battery, a reserve of life force that could be tapped into only during a time of ultimate catastrophe, a final gift for a son he would never see grow to manhood. "I buried that yam to feed you when the world ended," she cried, her voice cracking as she looked at Kofi, "but I did not bury it for you to take it with greed in your heart." The revelation sent a shockwave through the crowd. The yam Kofi had stolen wasn't just a plant. It was the physical manifestation of his father's sacrifice, a relic of a blood oath that had been violated. The earth wasn't just punishing a thief. It was reacting to a desecration of a father's final will. The soil around Kofi's waist began to churn, a deep, resonant vibration that felt like a growl, as the spirits within the ground processed the truth of the lineage. Kofi realized with a sickening clarity that he hadn't just stolen from the grove. He had stolen from his own father's grave, turning a gift of love into a curse of theft. The geography of the theft now took on a terrifying significance. The spot where Kofi had dug, the place near the ancient silk cotton tree with the gnarled roots, was not just the center of the grove. It was the unmarked resting place of Kwabena. The yam he had unearthed had been growing directly out of his father's chest, its roots entwined with the ribs of the man who had died so his family might live. As Amma spoke, the wind began to pick up, a hot, dry harmattan breeze that carried the scent of ancient dust and forgotten prayers. The crowd looked toward the grove, and for a moment the shimmering heat distorted the air so much that the trees seemed to take on human shapes, a forest of silent fathers watching the judgment of a wayward son. The realization that Kofi was being swallowed by the very essence of his father's remains sent a chill through the courtyard that even the midday sun couldn't warm. It was a Gothic irony that only the African soil could produce. A son being reclaimed by the father he was trying to honor through a misguided act of desperation. The physical sensation for Kofi shifted again. The pressure around his waist was no longer just the weight of dirt. It felt like hands, thousands of tiny, skeletal hands, grasping at his skin, pulling him deeper into the earth's embrace. He could feel the shape of fingers pressing into his thighs, the texture of the soil becoming increasingly mimic of human anatomy. The elders began to perform a spontaneous ritual, pouring libations of schnapps onto the ground at the edge of the circle, hopping to appease the spirit of Kwabna, which they now believed was the driving force behind the earth's hunger. But the ground refused the offering, the liquid sitting on the surface like beads of mercury, before evaporating instantly into the hot air. "The blood has already been spilled," Nana Osei whispered, his eyes wide with the realization that they were witnessing something beyond their control. The father was not seeking an apology, he was seeking an accounting. The stolen yam, still hidden under the corn husks, began to emit a low, vibrating hum that could be heard by everyone in the courtyard, a sound like a heartbeat that was slowly fading, mirroring the failing health of both the mother and the son. The connection between the theft, the father's grave, and the current judgment was a closed loop, a spiritual circuit that could only be broken by a force as powerful as the one that had created it. As the afternoon shadows began to lengthen, a strange atmospheric phenomenon took hold of Ashanti. The wind didn't just blow, it began to whisper, a multi-layered sound that seemed to consist of 1,000 different voices speaking in a dialect of Twi that was so old it was barely intelligible. It wasn't a sound heard with the ears, but with the bones, a vibration that told the story of every soul that had ever been returned to the Ashanti soil. The wind swirled around Kofi, lifting the dust into a miniature cyclone that obscured him from view for several minutes. Within that dust, the villagers saw flashes of the past, the famine, the burial, the planting of the yam, and the desperate, late-night journey of a son trying to save his mother. The wind carried the weight of a deliberation, the spirits of the grove arguing amongst themselves like a celestial jury. Some voices were harsh, demanding the full measure of the law, a life for a life, a soul for a desecration, while others were softer, weeping with the recognition of the love that had driven the crime. The ground beneath Kofi paused its upward climb, the soil trembling and shifting as if the earth itself were shivering in indecision. For the first time since sunrise, the relentless progress of the swallowing stopped, the dirt hovering at the level of his navel. The silence that followed the wind was more terrifying than the noise had been. It was a pregnant, heavy silence that felt like the moment before a lightning strike. Kofi, his face pale and his eyes sunken, looked out at the village, his gaze finally resting on his mother. In that moment of stasis, the moral paradox of the situation was laid bare for everyone to see. He was a thief. Yes, but he was a thief of necessity, a son driven by the most primal and noble of human instincts. The elders stood paralyzed, their traditional laws clashing with the undeniable reality of the boy's intent. The wind began to circle again, but this time it carried a specific message, a low, guttural vibration that seemed to emanate from the very roots beneath Kofi's feet. The earth was no longer just a judge. It was a witness to the history of a family's suffering, and it was waiting for one final thing before it delivered its ultimate verdict, a confession not of the act, but of the heart. The air in the courtyard did not just grow heavy. It became thick with the weight of 1,000 invisible deliberations, a metaphysical courtroom where the air shimmered with the heat of a divine argument. The ground beneath Kofi, which had remained frozen at his navel, began to vibrate with a low-frequency hum that seemed to resonate within the very bones of the villagers, making their teeth ache and their vision blur at the edges. It was as if the spirits of the ancestors, the silent guardians of the Ashanti Grove, were locked in a violent, subterranean debate, their voices manifesting as localized tremors that sent cracks spiderwebbing through the dry mud of the compound. Some of these vibrations were sharp and jagged, representing the old laws of the Ashanti, the uncompromising demand for purity and the absolute sanctity of the grove, while others were slow, rolling waves of empathy that seemed to carry the scent of rain and the warmth of a mother's embrace. The modern world, with its cellular towers and its asphalt roads, felt millions of miles away as the village became the epicenter of a primordial struggle. The elders stood like statues, their libation gourds empty, their eyes wide with the realization that they were no longer the mediators of this conflict. They were merely spectators to a judgment that was being weighed on scales of earth and blood, a trial where the evidence was the history of a family's suffering, and the motive was a son's desperate, shattered love. Kofi's consciousness was drifting, caught in the slipstream between the physical agony of the soil's pressure and a surreal, visionary landscape where the trees of the grove had faces, and the roots spoke in the voices of his dead kin. He felt the vibration of the earth not as a threat, but as a conversation, a chaotic, overlapping roar of opinions that questioned the very nature of his existence. He saw the faces of the grandfathers he had never met, their expressions shifting from righteous fury to a weary, profound sadness as they looked upon the stolen yam that lay rotting under the corn husks. The earth around him churned, the dirt turning over and over like a stomach processing a poison it couldn't quite decide to digest or vomit back up. Every few minutes, a sudden, violent jolt would ripple through his spine, as if a particularly harsh spirit had struck the ground in anger, only to be smoothed over by a subsequent, soothing vibration that felt like his father's hand on his shoulder. The crowd watched in a terrified trance, seeing the way the soil around Kofi seemed to be boiling without heat, the red clay swirling in patterns that mimicked the intricate, symbolic designs of Adinkra cloth. It was the moment of the great hesitation, the point where the ancient machinery of the universe paused to consider if a holy sin could ever be forgiven by a just God. As the vibration reached a crescendo that threatened to collapse the very hut behind him, Kofi's eyes flew open, burning with a clarity that was more terrifying than his previous delirium. He did not look at the elders, and he did not look at the sky. He looked directly into the soil that was claiming him and began to speak, his voice no longer a dry hiss but a resonant, booming confession that seemed to be amplified by the earth itself. He spoke of the neon-lit hallways of the Kumasi hospital, describing the sterile, indifferent smell of death, and the way the doctors' voices sounded like the rustling of dry paper when they spoke of costs and canisters. He detailed the specific, agonizing sound of his mother's lungs failing, a sound like a bird trapped in a cage of water, and how each of her gasps had felt like a hammer blow to his own chest. He confessed not just to the theft of the yam, but to the theft of his own pride, admitting that he had walked into the grove not as a warrior or a rebel, but as a broken man who had run out of world to stand on. "I did not take it for the belly," he cried, his voice echoing off the surrounding trees. "I took it for the breath. I traded the peace of the dead for the life of the living, and if the grove demands my blood to pay for her air, then let the roots drink until they are full." The admission was like a key turning in a lock that had been rusted shut for a century, the atmosphere in the courtyard shifting from a state of chaotic argument to one of heavy, absolute silence. The confession stripped away the ambiguity of the crime, laying bare the raw, bleeding heart of the motivation, and for a moment, the very wind seemed to stop to consider the weight of his words. The villagers, many of whom had secretly harbored their own moments of desperation in the face of the changing world, felt a collective shiver of recognition. They saw in Kofi not a criminal, but a mirror of their own struggles to survive in a country that was moving too fast for its own traditions. The stolen yam, still hidden, seemed to pulse in response to his words, its dark skin glowing with a faint, internal light that matched the rhythm of his confession. Kofi's mother, Amma, let out a low, mournful wail that was less a cry of grief and more a release of the secret she had carried since the famine, the knowledge that her husband's sacrifice had finally come full circle. The confession was the final piece of the spiritual puzzle, a verbal blood offering that satisfied the grove's requirement for truth, even if it had not yet satisfied its requirement for justice. The ground beneath him groaned, a deep, tectonic sound that signaled the beginning of the end, as the jury of the soil prepared to deliver its final, uncompromising verdict. Nana Osai stepped forward into the silence, his staff trembling in his hand as he looked at the half-buried boy who had just challenged the moral foundations of their entire history. The elder was caught in a paralysis of tradition. The laws of the Ashanti were clear. The grove was sacred. The theft was a capital spiritual offense, and the ancestors did not negotiate with the needs of the flesh. Yet, as he looked at the blistering, blackened palms of Akasua and the fatting, skeletal frame of Amma, he realized that to execute Kofi would be to finish the work of the famine that had already taken so much from this family. He turned to the other elders, their faces etched with the same agonizing conflict, and they began to speak in hushed, urgent tones that the wind carried to the edges of the crowd. They debated the justice of the heart versus the justice of the law, questioning if a grove that was grown from the blood of a father's sacrifice could truly demand the death of that father's only son. It was a paradox that the modern world would have settled with a courtroom and a lawyer, but here, in the shadow of the Ashanti trees, it was a question of cosmic equilibrium. If they spared him, did they weaken the sacred boundary that protected them all? If they killed him, did they become more monstrous than the famine itself? The villagers began to join the debate, their voices rising in a discordant symphony of opinions that reflected the fractured identity of the modern African village. The younger men, those who wore branded T-shirts and dreamed of moving to Accra, argued that the grove was a relic, and that Kofi's love was the only thing that mattered, while the older women, the keepers of the shrines, whispered that to ignore the grove's wrath was to invite a drought that would kill them all. This was not just a trial of one man. It was a trial of a culture trying to find its footing in a century that demanded it abandon its ghosts. The soil around Kofi's waist began to settle, the churning stopping as if the earth were listening to the villagers, waiting for them to reach a consensus that it could then either ratify or reject. The heat in the courtyard became unbearable, the sun a blinding white disk that seemed to be melting the very horizon, forcing everyone to confront the reality that they were running out of time. The moral weight of the situation was a physical pressure that seemed to push the villagers closer together, forcing a community that had been drifting apart into a singular, focused moment of collective soul-searching. They were no longer just a village, they were a jury. And the verdict they were reaching for would define the soul of Ashanti for generations to come. Just as it seemed the elders might reach a point of mercy, the grove delivered a reminder that it was not a human institution subject to human whims. A sudden, terrifying sound erupted from the ground, a sound like the snapping of giant bones, as the roots beneath the soil began to constrict with a predatory efficiency. The earth around Kofi's legs didn't just hold him, it began to mold itself, the dirt taking on the distinct, anatomical shape of two massive, weathered hands that rose out of the depths to grip his thighs. These were not the hands of a monster, but the hands of a laborer, gnarled, powerful, and covered in the scars of a lifetime of tilling the soil. The crowd gasped as they recognized the shape. They were the hands of Kwabena, Kofi's father, manifested in the very clay he had been buried in. The grip was so tight that Kofi's face turned a bruised purple, his eyes bulging as the breath was squeezed out of him, the physical manifestation of a father's discipline reaching across the veil of death. It was a terrifying sight, a literal grasp of the grave that showed the ancestors were not interested in the village's debates. They were conducting their own, more intimate form of reckoning. The pain was no longer a dull ache. It was an agonizing, bone-crushing pressure that felt as though his legs were being transformed into wood, the nerves being replaced by the unyielding fiber of the silk cotton tree. Kofi let out a sound that was less a scream and more a wet, rhythmic thud of air, his body arching in the soil as the father's hands pulled him down another 3 inches. The message was clear. The debt was personal, and the payment was being extracted from the very flesh that the father had once nourished. Akasua tried to run forward again, but the heat radiating from the ground was now so intense that it singed the hem of her dress before she could even get close. The elders fell to their knees, realizing that they had lost control of the ritual, that the grove had bypassed their authority to deal directly with the bloodline. The soil began to glow with a dark ochre light, the vibration shifting into a rhythmic thud that matched the heartbeat of the forest. Kofi looked down at the hands made of dirt and saw the wedding ring his father had worn, a simple band of hammered brass, perfectly replicated in the red clay. In that moment of ultimate agony, he realized that he wasn't being killed. He was being held, a child caught in the grip of a father who was both furious at the theft and devastated by the reason for it. As the pressure reached the point of no return, Kofi's vision fractured, and he was pulled into a deep, internal space that was neither life nor death, a void where the logic of the grove was finally revealed. He stood in a forest of light, and before him were two figures. His father, Quabna, tall and stern with eyes like burning embers, and the spirit of the grove, a towering entity of leaves and shadows that seemed to encompass the entire world. The spirit demanded the boy's life, its voice the sound of a falling mountain, arguing that the law was the only thing that kept the chaos of the world at bay. It pointed to the stolen yam, which in this realm looked like a heart made of gold, and claimed that by taking it, Kofi had unraveled the thread that tied the village to the earth. But Quabna stood between them, his hands, the same hands that were currently crushing Kofi's legs in the physical world, raised in a gesture of protection. He argued not for his son's innocence, but for the blood right of the sacrifice he had made during the famine. He claimed that the yam was his to give, and if he chose to let his son steal what was already his by right of lineage, then the grove had no claim on the boy's soul. The argument was a silent, thunderous exchange of energy that rippled through Kofi's spirit, a weighing of the heart that felt like the sun and the moon crashing together. He saw the history of his people, the wars, the migrations, the rituals, and the countless times they had turned to the earth in their darkest hours, and he realized that the grove was not just a place of punishment, but a reservoir of the community's collective survival. The spirit of the grove began to recede, its fury spent, as it recognized the validity of the father's claim. The love that had driven the theft was a force as old and as sacred as the forest itself. The vision began to dissolve, the forest of light fading back into the red dust of the courtyard, but before he left, Kofi felt his father's hand touch his forehead, a cool, soothing touch that carried a message of both forgiveness and a warning. The price would still be paid, but it would not be paid in blood. It would be paid in the memory of the weight. The hands in the soil began to loosen their grip, the pressure receding like a retreating tide, as the cosmic jury finally reached its verdict. The spirits had accepted the trade, the truth of the heart for the sanctity of the grove, and the earth prepared to return what it had so nearly claimed forever. As the final sliver of the sun dipped below the horizon, plunging the village into the long, blue shadows of the African twilight, the ground beneath Kofi didn't just move. It groaned with a sound of profound relief. The soil, which had been as hard as iron all day, suddenly turned to the consistency of warm water, and with a violent, upward surge, the earth began to vomit Kofi back into the air. He was propelled upward as if the ground were a living lung exhaling a deep-seated breath, the dirt sliding off his skin with a wet, slithering sound. The villagers fell back in terror, and awe as the boy they had watched sink all day was suddenly standing, or rather, collapsing onto the surface of the courtyard, his body covered in a thick, dark slime that smelled of ancient rain and deep, subterranean minerals. The father's hands dissolved back into the dust, leaving only a pair of deep, perfectly formed indentations in the ground where they had been. Kofi lay on the surface, gasping for air, his lungs burning as they tasted the cooling evening breeze for the first time in 12 hours. The paralysis that had gripped his legs was gone, replaced by a pin's end needle sensation so intense it made him weep, the blood finally rushing back into his starved tissues. The release was not just physical, it was as if a tension wire that had been stretched across the entire village had suddenly been cut. Akasua rushed forward, her bandaged hands reaching out to pull her brother away from the sinking spot. And this time the ground did not burn her. It was cool, soft, and ordinary. The elders approached with a cautious reverence, looking at the spot where Kofi had been buried, and finding that the soil there was now incredibly rich. A dark, fertile black that stood in stark contrast to the red clay of the rest of the yard. The stolen yam, which had been the cause of the day's nightmare, was found sitting on top of the pile of corn husks, but it was no longer dark and obsidian. It had turned a pale, ghostly white, all its life force having been drained back into the earth to seal the debt. Amma, who had been on the verge of death all day, suddenly sat up in her chair, a deep, clear breath rattling in her chest as the spiritual weight of the curse was lifted from her lineage. The grove, visible in the distance, seemed to settle into a peaceful, silent slumber, the awake energy that had radiated from it all day vanishing like smoke in the wind. The village was silent, the only sound the chirping of the first night crickets, as they realized they had witnessed a miracle of the old world surviving in the heart of the new. The morning after the judgment of the grove, the village of Ashanti woke up to a world that looked the same but felt fundamentally altered. Kofi was alive, though he would never walk with the same ease again. When the doctors finally examined him, they found that the skin of his legs had been permanently transformed. From his ankles to his waist, his flesh was no longer smooth. It was covered in a network of fine, silver-gray scars that perfectly mimicked the texture and grain of a yam's skin, a biological map of the debt he had incurred. More strikingly, on the back of each calf, the unmistakable shape of his father's hands remained, the scars deep and indented as if the earth had carved the memory of the grip into his very muscle. He was a walking testament to the grove's mercy and its memory, a man who carried the weight of the soil in his stride. His mother, Amma, made a recovery that the hospital staff in Kumasi called statistically impossible, her lungs clearing as if they had been washed by a subterranean spring. Though she never again spoke of the famine, or the secret name Kofi had screamed in his delirium. The sinking spot in the courtyard became a place of local pilgrimage, though not the kind that brought tourists. It was a place where the villagers came to settle disputes, believing that the truth was easier to tell when standing on the ground that had once swallowed a man. The elders, led by a humbler Nana Osai, revised the village laws to include provisions for the desperate heart, recognizing that tradition must breathe or it will surely suffocate the living. Kofi himself eventually returned to the outskirts of the sacred grove, not to steal, but to plant, becoming a guardian of the boundary he had once crossed in darkness. He lived with the knowledge that he was never truly alone, that every step he took was being watched by the roots beneath his feet and the Father beneath the roots. The silver scars on his legs would itch whenever the rains were late or whenever he felt the stirrings of greed, a constant, physical reminder of the day the earth argued for his soul. He was freed at sunset, as the elders said, because love had called him there. But as he walked the paths of Ashanti, the heavy, rhythmic sound of his footsteps served as a reminder to all who heard them. The earth never forgets a debt, and it always, eventually, claims what is its own. Kofi was freed at sunset, but the earth kept its receipt. Today, he carries his father's handprints carved permanently into his skin, a reminder that the soil knows the difference between greed and sacrifice. If the ground beneath you started to speak, would you be brave enough to listen? Follow for more ancient justice.